The roar of the crowd at Amarillo Civic Center was deafening that Saturday evening in October. 8,000 spectators packed the arena, their voices creating a wall of sound that seemed to vibrate through the metal bleachers and concrete floors. The air was thick with the smell of popcorn, beer, and the unmistakable scent of livestock that defined every rodeo venue across Texas. Dust particles danced in the bright arena lights, creating an almost mystical atmosphere that had become as familiar to Caleb Rogers as his own heartbeat. Caleb adjusted his protective vest one more time, running his calloused hands over the familiar leather and padding that had saved his ribs more times than he could count. At 28, he had been riding bulls professionally for over a decade, and his body carried the evidence of every fall, every successful ride, every near miss that had shaped him into one of the top riders on the professional bull riders circuit. His dark hair was already damp with sweat beneath his black cowboy hat, and his green eyes held that focused intensity that his competitors had loved to respect and fear. "You ready for this one, Caleb?" asked Tommy Martinez, his traveling partner and closest friend on the circuit. Tommy had been riding bulls almost as long as Caleb, but injuries had slowed him down in recent years. Now he served as Caleb's unofficial advisor and constant source of encouragement. The two men had grown up together in the small town of Weatherford, Texas, learning to ride on the same practice bulls, dating the same girls in high school, and eventually following their dreams to the professional circuit together. Caleb nodded, spitting into the dirt beside the chute. "Duststorm's been having a good year. Hasn't been ridden successfully in his last 12 outings. But I've studied the footage." He goes left out of the chute, then switches direction about 4 seconds in. "If I can stay centered and adjust my grip when he makes that move." He trailed off, visualizing the ride in his mind for what felt like the 100th time that day. Duststorm was a massive Brahma bull, weighing in at nearly 2,000 pounds of pure muscle and attitude. The animal had earned a reputation as one of the most challenging bulls on the circuit, with a bucking pattern that seemed to defy physics and a mean streak that had sent more than one rider to the hospital. The announcement echoed through the arena, cutting through the crowd noise like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next rider is currently sitting third in the world standings. From Weatherford, Texas, weighing in at 165 pounds, please welcome Caleb Rogers." The crowd erupted as Caleb's name appeared on the massive video screen above the arena. His statistics flashed across the display. Current world ranking, previous victories, career earnings that had crossed the $1 million mark 3 years earlier. But none of those numbers mattered now. All that mattered were the next 8 seconds. Caleb climbed the metal rails of chute number 4, where Duststorm waited with the patience of a predator. The bull's dark eyes seemed to follow Caleb's movements, and his massive head swayed slightly from side to side, as if he were already planning his strategy for dislodging the human who dared to climb onto his back. "Remember what we talked about?" Tommy called up from below. "Keep your free hand high, don't fight him on that first spin, and whatever you do, don't lean back when he drops his front end." Caleb acknowledged the advice with a quick nod, but his attention was already completely focused on the animal beneath him. He had developed a pre-ride ritual over the years, a series of movements and mental preparations that helped center his mind and prepare his body for the violence that was about to unfold. He flexed his fingers inside his riding glove, worked the resin into the braided rope that would be his only connection to the bull, and took 3 deep breaths. The arena fell silent except for the constant shuffling and snorting of the bull in the chute. Even the crowd seemed to sense the tension building as Caleb lowered himself onto Duststorm's broad back. The bull's hide was warm and slightly damp, and Caleb could feel the enormous muscles coiled beneath him like springs ready to explode. He wrapped the bull rope around his right hand, working it through his fingers with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed this same ritual hundreds of times. The rope was his lifeline and his potential death trap, designed to keep him connected to the bull, but also capable of dragging him to serious injury if he couldn't free himself quickly enough when the ride ended. "You good?" asked Jake Wilson, the chute boss, his weathered face showing the concern that came with 30 years of watching young men risk their lives for 8-second rides. "I'm good," Caleb responded, though his voice carried a slight tremor that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the adrenaline that was beginning to flood his system. He pulled his hat down tight and raised his left hand high in the air, the signal that he was ready for the chute gate to open. The crowd began to chant his name, a rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Everything else faded away, the lights, the noise, the thousands of watching eyes. There was only Caleb, the bull, and the 8 seconds that would determine whether he moved closer to his second world championship or left the arena on a stretcher. "Let's go," Caleb shouted, and the chute gate swung open. Duststorm exploded from the chute with a violence that defied description. The bull's first jump sent both his front and rear hooves several feet off the ground, his massive body twisting in a motion that would have been graceful if it weren't so clearly designed to destroy anything clinging to his back. Caleb felt the familiar shock of the initial buck, his body absorbing the impact through his legs and core while his free hand fought to maintain balance in the air above his head. 2 seconds. Duststorm landed hard and immediately launched into his signature left-hand spin, his powerful hindquarters driving in a circle while his front end seemed to stay in one place. Caleb had seen this move on video dozens of times, but experiencing it firsthand was like being caught in a tornado. The centrifugal force tried to pull him toward the outside of the spin, and he had to fight against every instinct that told him to lean away from the center of the rotation. 4 seconds. Just as Caleb had predicted, Duststorm suddenly changed direction, switching from the left-hand spin to a series of straight, punishing bucks that sent shock waves through Caleb's spine. His hat flew off somewhere during the transition, and he could feel his grip on the bull rope beginning to loosen as sweat made his gloves slippery. 6 seconds. Duststorm dropped his front end low and kicked his rear legs high, a move designed to send riders flying over his head. Caleb managed to stay centered, his years of experience allowing him to anticipate the move and adjust his position just enough to maintain his seat. The crowd was on its feet now, sensing that they might be witnessing something special. 7 seconds. One more second and Caleb would have a qualifying ride, putting him in excellent position to overtake the world standings leader. Duststorm seemed to sense that his time was running out, and the bull gathered himself for one final, desperate attempt to dislodge his rider. 7.5 seconds. Duststorm launched himself into the highest buck of the ride, his entire body seeming to hang in the air for an impossible moment. Caleb felt himself being thrown forward, his balance shifting dangerously toward the bull's head. He tried to compensate by leaning back, but the move came a fraction of a second too late. 8 seconds. The horn sounded just as Caleb's grip finally gave way. He had made the whistle, but he was falling forward over Duststorm's head, his body positioned exactly where it shouldn't be as the massive bull came crashing back down to earth. Time seemed to slow as Caleb realized what was about to happen, but there was nothing he could do to change his trajectory. Duststorm's front hooves hit the ground first, followed immediately by his massive head as he bucked one final time. Caleb's body, still moving forward from the momentum of the fall, collided with the metal gate post at the exact moment his head was positioned between it and the bull's skull. The impact sounded like a gunshot, echoing through the suddenly silent arena. Caleb's body went limp instantly, crumpling to the arena dirt like a discarded doll. Duststorm, his job finished, trotted away from the motionless figure with the casual indifference of an animal that had simply been doing what bulls do. The crowd's cheers died in their throats as they realized something was seriously wrong. Tommy was the first person to reach Caleb's side, vaulting over the arena fence with an agility that belied his 32 years. The arena's medical team was close behind, their practiced movements speaking to the unfortunate frequency with which they had to deal with injuries of this magnitude. Caleb, can you hear me?" Tommy knelt beside his friend, careful not to move him, but desperate for some sign of consciousness. Caleb's eyes were closed, his face pale beneath the dirt and dust that covered it. A thin line of blood trickled from his left ear onto the arena floor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the arena's chief medical officer, gently pushed Tommy aside as she began her preliminary examination. She had seen hundreds of bull riding injuries during her 15 years on the circuit, but the mechanism of this particular injury, the crushing blow between the bull's head and the gate post, was one of the most dangerous scenarios possible. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," she announced to her team. "Possible traumatic brain injury. Alert Amarillo Emergency Hospital that we're coming in with a priority 1 trauma." The stretcher arrived within minutes, and Caleb was carefully immobilized before being carried from the arena. The crowd watched in respectful silence as the ambulance lights flashed red and blue against the arena walls. Tommy followed close behind, his phone already pressed to his ear as he called Caleb's family back in Weatherford. "Mrs. Rogers? It's Tommy. There's been an accident." The drive to Amarillo Emergency Hospital took 12 minutes, though it felt like hours to everyone involved. Caleb remained unconscious throughout the transport, his vital signs stable, but his lack of response to stimulus deeply concerning to the paramedics who worked over him in the back of the ambulance. The emergency room team was waiting when they arrived, and Caleb was immediately wheeled into Trauma Bay 3 for a full neurological assessment. Dr. James Hawkins, the hospital's chief of neurology, took charge of the case personally after reviewing the mechanism of injury and the initial field reports. "I want a full CT scan of his head and neck, MRI as soon as he's stable enough, and I want the trauma surgery team on standby," Dr. Hawkins ordered as the medical team worked to stabilize their patient. This kind of impact can cause brain bleeding, swelling, or worse. In the waiting room, Tommy paced back and forth across the worn linoleum floor, his boots clicking against the hard surface with metronomic precision. He had called Caleb's parents, his sister Rachel, and his girlfriend Emma, and now all he could do was wait for news. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh, sterile glow that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation. Rachel Rogers arrived first, having driven the 3 hours from Weatherford at speeds that would have earned her multiple tickets under normal circumstances. She was 26, 2 years younger than Caleb, and had inherited the same stubborn determination that had driven her brother to the top of the bull-riding world. The difference was that Rachel had channeled that determination into becoming a veterinarian rather than climbing onto the backs of animals that wanted to kill her. "How is he?" she asked Tommy before she had even finished walking through the automatic doors. "Still unconscious. They've got him in for tests now. The doctor said it could be a while before we know anything definitive." Emma Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, her face streaked with tears and her dark hair disheveled from the wind. She and Caleb had been dating for almost 2 years, and she had been watching the ride from the stands when the accident happened. The image of his motionless body on the arena floor was burned into her memory, and she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. "The last thing he said to me before the ride was that he was feeling really good about this one," Emma told Rachel as they sat together in the uncomfortable plastic chairs that lined the waiting room. "He said Duststorm was going to be the ride that put him over the top for the World Championship." Dr. Hawkins emerged from the trauma unit after what felt like an eternity, but had actually been less than 2 hours. His expression was carefully neutral, the practiced look of a man who had delivered both good news and devastating news to families more times than he cared to count. "The CT scan shows some swelling in his brain, but no signs of active bleeding," he began, and Tommy felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "The good news is that his vital signs are stable, and his brain activity appears normal. The concerning part is that he hasn't regained consciousness yet, which suggests a significant concussion at minimum." "When will he wake up?" Rachel asked, her veterinary training giving her enough medical knowledge to ask the right questions. "That's difficult to predict with head injuries. It could be hours or it could be days. The brain needs time to heal, and we can't rush that process. What I can tell you is that we're going to monitor him very closely over the next 24 to 48 hours. That's typically when we see the most critical developments in cases like this." The doctor paused, his expression becoming even more serious. "There's something else you should know. Even when he does wake up, there's a possibility of complications. Memory loss is common with this type of injury, particularly involving recent events or specialized skills. Given that this happened during a bull riding accident, there's a chance that his memories related to the sport could be affected." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. For Caleb Rogers, bull riding wasn't just a job or even a passion. It was his entire identity. He had been riding bulls for more than half his life, and everything about who he was as a person was tied to the sport that had just nearly killed him. 3 days passed before Caleb's eyes finally opened, blinking slowly against the soft light filtering through the hospital room blinds. The first thing he noticed was the antiseptic smell that seemed to coat the inside of his nose and throat, followed immediately by the dull, throbbing pain that pulsed through his skull in rhythm with his heartbeat. He tried to move his head to look around the room, but the motion sent sharp spikes of agony through his neck and shoulders. "Easy there, cowboy," a gentle voice said from somewhere to his right. "You've been sleeping for a while, and your body needs time to catch up." Caleb's vision slowly focused on the figure sitting beside his bed. It was a woman with kind brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore scrubs covered in a pattern of cartoon horses, and her name tag identified her as Linda RN. Something about her presence felt comforting, though he couldn't quite place why. "Where?" His voice came out as barely more than a whisper, his throat feeling like sandpaper. Linda immediately reached for a cup of water with a straw, helping him take small sips until he could speak more clearly. Where am I? You're at Amarillo Emergency Hospital, Linda explained, her voice maintaining that calm, professional tone that nurses perfected for dealing with confused patients. You had an accident 3 days ago. Do you remember anything about what happened? Caleb closed his eyes and tried to think, but his mind felt wrapped in cotton. There were flashes of images, bright lights, loud noises, the smell of dust and animals, but they seemed disconnected from each other, like scattered pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that he couldn't figure out how to put together. I remember lights, he said slowly. And noise. Lots of noise. But I can't remember why. Before Linda could respond, the door to his room opened and a tall man in a white coat entered, followed closely by 3 people whose faces seemed familiar but nameless to Caleb's confused mind. The man in the white coat introduced himself as Dr. Hawkins, and he began asking Caleb a series of questions that seemed designed to test his mental clarity. Can you tell me your full name? Caleb. Caleb Rogers. Good. Do you know what year it is? 2023. The answer came automatically, though something about it didn't feel quite right. Actually, it's 2024, Dr. Hawkins corrected gently. Can you tell me what you do for work? This question created a long pause. Caleb felt like he should know the answer immediately, but his mind kept coming up blank. He could remember having a job, remember being good at something, but the specifics remained frustratingly out of reach. I'm not sure, he admitted, and he could see the concerned looks that passed between the 3 visitors standing at the foot of his bed. Caleb, this is your sister Rachel, your girlfriend Emma, and your friend Tommy, Dr. Hawkins explained, gesturing to each person in turn. They've been here waiting for you to wake up. Rachel stepped forward first, her eyes bright with tears she was trying hard not to shed. Hey, big brother. How are you feeling? The term big brother triggered something in Caleb's memory, and he found himself studying Rachel's face more carefully. There was something about her features that seemed like looking into a mirror, and gradually some memories began to surface. He could remember a younger version of this woman, someone who had followed him around their family's ranch, someone who had always been braver than her size suggested. Rachel, he said, and relief flooded her features. You used to climb to the top of the old oak tree behind the barn. Mom was always worried you'd fall. That's right, Rachel said, moving closer to take his hand. I'm so glad you remember some things. Emma approached more cautiously, her dark hair framing a face that was beautiful but marked by obvious exhaustion and worry. When she spoke, her voice carried a slight accent that suggested Spanish was her first language. Hi, Caleb. I'm Emma. We've been together for almost 2 years. Caleb studied her face intently, searching for some spark of recognition. She was undeniably attractive, and something about her seemed warm and familiar, but he couldn't access any specific memories of their relationship. The realization was clearly written on his face, and Emma's expression crumpled slightly before she recovered her composure. It's okay, she said quickly. The doctor said this might happen. The important thing is that you're awake, and you're going to be okay. Tommy had remained in the background during these exchanges, his weathered face showing an unusual level of emotional vulnerability. When Caleb's gaze finally settled on him, Tommy managed a weak smile and raised his hand in a small wave. Hey, partner, Tommy said. Good to have you back with us. Partner? Caleb asked, the word triggering another vague sense of familiarity. We've been traveling together for a lot of years, Tommy explained. We grew up together back in Weatherford, learned to ride together, went professional together. You probably don't remember right now, but we've had some good times on the road. Dr. Hawkins had been observing these interactions with the clinical attention of someone gathering data for a diagnosis. After a few more minutes of conversation, he asked the visitors to step outside so he could conduct a more thorough examination of his patient. Caleb, I need to ask you some more specific questions, Dr. Hawkins began once they were alone. You had an accident while you were bull riding. Do you have any memory of that event? Bull riding. The term sounded foreign to Caleb, like a language he might have once spoken but had somehow forgotten. Like, riding on actual bulls? The doctor's expression grew more serious. You're one of the top professional bull riders in the world, Caleb. You've been doing it professionally for over 10 years. The accident happened during a competition here in Amarillo. You were riding a bull called Duststorm when you fell and hit your head. Caleb tried to process this information, but it felt like being told he was secretly an astronaut or a famous movie star. The concept of voluntarily climbing onto the back of a massive, angry animal seemed not just foreign but completely insane. That doesn't That doesn't sound like something I would do, he said slowly. I mean, bulls are dangerous, right? Why would anyone want to ride them? Dr. Hawkins nodded, having seen this type of selective memory loss before in cases involving repetitive head trauma. What I'm going to tell you might be difficult to understand, but the type of injury you sustained can sometimes cause what we call retrograde amnesia. Essentially, your brain has lost access to certain memories, particularly those related to recent events or highly specialized activities. So I might never remember bull riding? It's possible that some memories will return over time, especially as your brain heals from the trauma. But I have to be honest with you. There's also a chance that some memories may be permanently lost. The brain is incredibly complex, and we still don't understand everything about how memory works. Over the next several days, as Caleb's physical condition improved, the full extent of his memory loss became apparent. He could remember his childhood on the family ranch in Weatherford, his parents, his sister, and even some of his early school years. But everything related to bull riding, the training, the competitions, the lifestyle, the relationships he had built within the sport, was simply gone. Emma spent hours showing him photographs and videos on her phone, trying to trigger some recognition. There were pictures of the two of them at various rodeos across the country, images of Caleb receiving championship buckles and prize money, videos of successful rides that had built his reputation as one of the sport's elite competitors. To Caleb, it was like watching a movie starring someone who happened to look exactly like him. "This is us in Las Vegas last year," Emma explained, showing him a photo of them together at the National Finals Rodeo. "You had just won the championship round, and we went out to celebrate afterward. You said it was one of the best nights of your life." Caleb studied the image carefully. The man in the photo was definitely him. Same face, same build, same crooked smile that he could see when he looked in the mirror. But the person in the photo was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, holding a trophy he couldn't remember winning, standing in a place he had no memory of visiting. "I can see that it's me," he said carefully, "but it's like looking at pictures of a stranger. I don't remember any of this." Tommy tried a different approach, focusing on their personal relationship rather than the professional aspects of bull riding. He told stories about their childhood in Weatherford, about the trouble they had gotten into as teenagers, about the dreams they had shared of making it to the professional level in rodeo. "You remember when we were 16 and you talked me into sneaking into Old Man Patterson's pasture to practice on his bulls?" Tommy asked during one visit. "We thought we were so tough until that little Brahma cross sent you flying into the fence." For a moment, Caleb's eyes lit up with recognition. "I remember the fence," he said slowly. "And I remember you laughing so hard you nearly fell off your own bull. But I can't remember why we were there or what we were trying to do. It was progress, but it was also frustrating for everyone involved." Caleb could remember fragments, pieces of scenes and emotions, but the context that gave those fragments meaning was missing. It was like having a library where all the books had been rearranged randomly, with pages torn out and scattered throughout different volumes. Rachel, with her practical veterinary background, tried to approach the situation from a more clinical perspective. She researched traumatic brain injuries and memory loss, hoping to find some technique or therapy that might help restore her brother's missing memories. "According to what I've read, sometimes returning to familiar environments can help trigger memory recovery," she told Dr. Hawkins during one of their conversations. "Would it be helpful to take him back to Weatherford once he's released from the hospital?" "That's actually not a bad idea," the doctor replied. "Familiar places, smells, and routines can sometimes help the brain reconnect with lost memories. But you also need to be prepared for the possibility that the memories related to bull riding may never return. The brain tends to protect itself by blocking access to memories associated with trauma." "What does that mean for his career?" Rachel asked. "I mean, even if he could physically return to bull riding, would it be safe for him to compete without those memories?" Dr. Hawkins shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. Bull riding at the professional level requires muscle memory, split-second decision-making, and an understanding of animal behavior that takes years to develop. Without access to those memories and instincts, attempting to ride would be essentially suicide. Even if his memories returned partially, I would strongly advise against him ever competing again." This conversation was happening outside Caleb's room, but through the partially open door, he could hear enough to understand what they were discussing. The realization that his career, whatever that career had been, was essentially over before he could even remember what it had involved was both devastating and strangely liberating. When the others returned to his room, Caleb was staring out the window at the Texas sky, watching clouds drift across the horizon in patterns that seemed somehow significant but remained just out of his mental reach. I heard what the doctor said, he told them without turning away from the window, about not being able to ride anymore. Emma started to speak, probably to offer some words of comfort or encouragement, but Caleb continued before she could find the right words. The strange thing is, I'm not sure I'm upset about it. I mean, I know I should be devastated because apparently this was my whole life, but right now it just feels like being told I can't do something I never wanted to do anyway. Tommy moved to stand beside the bed, his expression thoughtful. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, partner. I've been writing for 15 years, and I can tell you that it takes a toll on a man. Your body, your relationships, your peace of mind. Everything gets sacrificed for those 8 seconds of glory. Is that why you do it? Caleb asked, finally turning from the window to look at his friend. For the glory? I used to think so, Tommy admitted. But watching you lying there unconscious for 3 days made me realize that maybe there are more important things in life than proving you can stay on a bull's back. The room fell quiet as everyone absorbed the weight of Tommy's words. Outside, the October sun was beginning to set, painting the hospital room in shades of orange and gold that reminded Caleb of something he couldn't quite place. It was like standing at the edge of a memory that refused to come into focus, beautiful but frustratingly incomplete. Emma had been unusually quiet during this exchange, and when Caleb looked at her, he could see that she was struggling with emotions she didn't quite know how to express. "What are you thinking?" he asked her gently. "I'm thinking that I fell in love with a bull rider named Caleb Rogers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And now I'm wondering if that person still exists, or if I need to figure out how to love whoever you're going to become." Her honesty was both painful and refreshing. In the days since he had awakened, everyone had been walking on eggshells around him, afraid to say anything that might upset him or complicate his recovery. Emma's willingness to voice the fear that they were all carrying felt like opening a window in a stuffy room. "I don't know who I'm going to become either," Caleb replied. "But I know that whoever that person is, he's going to need to figure out how to build a life that makes sense. And I don't think that life is going to involve climbing onto the backs of animals that want to kill me." Dr. Hawkins returned to the room an hour later with news that Caleb was ready to be discharged from the hospital. His physical injuries were healing well, and there were no signs of complications from the brain trauma. However, he would need to follow up with a neurologist in 2 weeks and avoid any activities that could result in another head injury. "I'm also going to recommend that you start working with a counselor who specializes in traumatic brain injuries," the doctor added. "Losing such a significant portion of your identity and memories can be emotionally challenging, and professional support can be very helpful during the adjustment period." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Caleb found himself feeling anxious about what came next. For the first time in his adult life, he had no clear sense of purpose or direction. The career that had apparently defined him for over a decade was gone, the memories that had shaped his identity were missing, and even his relationship with the woman who claimed to love him felt like starting over from scratch. "Where am I going to live?" he asked Rachel as they waited for the discharge paperwork to be completed. "I assume I had my own place somewhere, but I don't remember where." "You've been staying in a condo in Fort Worth when you're not traveling," Rachel explained. "But Tommy and Emma think it might be better if you came back to Weatherford for a while. Mom and Dad have been worried sick, and being around family might help with your recovery." The idea of returning to his childhood home felt both appealing and terrifying. On one hand, it represented the only life he could clearly remember. On the other hand, it felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that the adult version of himself had somehow failed so completely that he needed to retreat to the safety of his parents' protection. "What about my stuff?" he asked. "I mean, I assume I own things. Clothes, furniture, maybe a truck." Tommy laughed for the first time since the accident. "Oh, you definitely own a truck. A big, ridiculous, expensive truck that you spent way too much money on because it matched your belt buckles. And yes, you've got clothes and furniture and probably enough belt buckles to open your own Western wear store." "Belt buckles? Prize buckles from competitions. You've won a lot of them over the years. They're kind of like trophies, but cowboys wear them to show off their achievements." As they made their way through the hospital corridors toward the exit, Caleb caught a glimpse of himself in a reflective surface. The man looking back at him appeared older than he felt, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into arena lights and wind. There was a small bandage covering the stitches where his head had hit the gate post, and his face still showed the yellowish remnants of bruising from the accident. But what struck him most was the expression in his own eyes. There was a wariness there, an uncertainty that felt foreign to his personality. Even with his fragmented memories, he had always thought of himself as someone who was confident and decisive. The person in the reflection looked lost. "You ready for this?" Emma asked, linking her arm through his as they approached the hospital's main entrance. "I don't think anyone's ever ready to rebuild their entire life from scratch," Caleb replied. "But I guess we're about to find out what I'm made of." As they stepped outside into the cool October air, Caleb took a deep breath and tried to imagine what his future might look like. For the first time in over a decade, that future was completely uncertain, unscripted, and entirely his own to write. The drive back to Weatherford took less than 2 hours, but for Caleb it felt like traveling through layers of time itself. As they left the urban sprawl of the Fort Worth Metroplex behind and entered the rolling hills of Parker County, fragments of memory began stirring in ways they hadn't during his week in the hospital. The landscape felt familiar in a way that went deeper than conscious recognition. It was written into his bones, part of the fundamental programming that had shaped who he was before bull riding had redefined his identity. Emma drove his truck, a massive black Ford F-350 that Tommy hadn't been exaggerating about. The interior was immaculate black leather with custom stitching, and the sound system was sophisticated enough to make a recording studio jealous. What struck Caleb most, though, were the personal touches that spoke to a life he couldn't remember. A St. Christopher medal hanging from the rearview mirror, a photo of him and Emma tucked into the sun visor, and a collection of championship buckles displayed in a custom case mounted to the dashboard. "You had this truck custom built 3 years ago," Emma explained as they navigated the familiar curves of Highway 180. "You said you wanted something that could pull a horse trailer but still look good enough to take to dinner at fancy restaurants." "Horse trailer?" Caleb asked, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "You have 2 horses back at your parents' place. Ranger and Rebel. They're both quarter horses that you trained yourself for practice and for just riding around the ranch." The mention of horses triggered something deeper than the fragmented images he had been recovering. Somewhere in his muscle memory, he could feel the familiar weight of reins in his hands, the rhythm of a horse's gait beneath him, the subtle communication between rider and animal that happened without conscious thought. It was the first time since the accident that he had felt truly connected to any aspect of his past life. "I want to see them," he said suddenly. "The horses, I mean. As soon as we get to the ranch." Emma smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness he had seen from her since the accident. "I think they've missed you. Your mom has been taking care of them, but Ranger especially has been looking for you every day." The Rogers family ranch appeared around a bend in the road, like something from a memory that had been waiting patiently for his return. The white farmhouse with its wraparound porch sat beneath massive oak trees that had probably been there since before Texas was a state. The red barn and outbuildings were exactly as he remembered them, and the sight of cattle grazing in the pastures beyond created a sense of coming home that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. His parents, David and Susan Rogers, were waiting on the front porch as the truck pulled up the gravel driveway. Both were in their early 60s, with the kind of weathered, practical appearance that came from decades of ranch work. His father was tall and lean, with gray hair beneath a battered cowboy hat, while his mother was small but carried herself with the quiet strength that Caleb was beginning to recognize as a family trait. "Welcome home, son," his father said simply, enveloping Caleb in a hug that smelled of hay, leather, and the aftershave he had worn for as long as Caleb could remember. There were tears in the older man's eyes, though he tried to hide them beneath the brim of his hat. His mother was less successful at concealing her emotions, and she cried openly as she held her son for the first time since the accident. "We were so scared," she whispered. "When Tommy called and said you were hurt, we didn't know if... We just didn't know." "I'm okay, Mom," Caleb assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Physically, he was healing well, but emotionally and mentally he felt like he was starting over from scratch at the age of 28. The family gathered in the kitchen, a large, comfortable room that served as the heart of the house. The walls were covered with family photos spanning decades, including many images of Caleb that he didn't remember posing for. There he was at high school graduation, at what appeared to be various rodeo events, accepting awards and trophies for accomplishments he couldn't recall achieving. "I know this must be strange for you," his mother said as she bustled around preparing coffee and sandwiches. "Seeing pictures of yourself doing things you don't remember." It's like looking at photos of someone who looks exactly like me but lived a completely different life, Caleb admitted. I can see that it's me in the pictures, but I don't feel any connection to that person. His father sat down across from him at the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that bore the logo of some long-forgotten rodeo. Son, I want you to know that whoever you are now, whoever you decide to become, you're still our boy. The bull riding was something you did, not who you were. But what if that's not true? Caleb asked. I mean, from what everyone tells me, I've been doing this for more than half my life. What if there's nothing left of me without it? Then we'll find out together, his mother said firmly. You're 28 years old, Caleb. Plenty of people don't figure out what they're supposed to do with their lives until they're much older than that. Maybe this is just your chance to start fresh. After lunch, Caleb excused himself to walk out to the barn where his horses were kept. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, with the kind of blue sky that seemed to stretch forever across the Texas plains. As he approached the barn, he could hear horses moving around inside, and the familiar sounds triggered another wave of muscle memory that felt like coming home. Ranger was a bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a white blaze down his face. The moment Caleb appeared at his stall door, the horse whinnied and pushed his nose against the bars, clearly recognizing his owner despite the weeks of absence. When Caleb reached out to stroke the horse's neck, Ranger leaned into the touch with an obvious contentment that spoke to years of partnership. Hey there, boy, Caleb said softly, and the words felt natural in a way that most of his interactions since the accident hadn't. I'm sorry I've been away. Rebel, a sorrel mare in the adjacent stall, was less demonstrative but equally pleased to see him. As Caleb moved between the two horses, brushing them and checking them over with hands that seemed to know exactly what they were doing, he felt more like himself than he had at any point since waking up in the hospital. I thought I might find you out here. Caleb turned to see Emma approaching, her expression softer than it had been during most of their interactions over the past week. She was wearing jeans and boots instead of the dress clothes she had worn to the hospital, and something about seeing her in more casual attire made her seem more approachable, more real. They remember me, Caleb said, continuing to brush Ranger's coat. I can't remember training them or buying them or anything about our history together, but they definitely remember me. Animals don't care about your career or your achievements, Emma observed, leaning against the stall door. They just know whether you're a good person or not. And you've always been good with horses. Emma, can I ask you something? Caleb said, not looking up from his grooming. And I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course. What was I like? I mean, as a person. Not as a bull rider, but just as a man. Was I someone you actually enjoyed being with? Or was I so focused on the sport that there wasn't much else to me? Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb could sense that she was choosing her words carefully. You were driven, she said finally. Maybe more driven than was healthy sometimes. You had this need to prove yourself that went beyond just winning competitions. It was like you were trying to prove something to the whole world, or maybe to yourself. She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note of sadness. But when you let your guard down, when you weren't thinking about rankings or prize money or the next big ride, you were one of the kindest, most thoughtful people I've ever known. You would remember little things about people, and you genuinely cared about making others feel important. And which version of me did you fall in love with? The second one, Emma said without hesitation. The problem was that he didn't show up very often during rodeo season. Caleb absorbed this information while continuing to work with the horses. It painted a picture of someone who had perhaps lost himself in the pursuit of success, someone who had allowed his identity to become so intertwined with his professional achievements that he had forgotten who he was underneath all the buckles and trophies. What if this accident was the best thing that ever happened to me? He asked suddenly. Emma looked startled by the suggestion. How can you say that? You nearly died, Caleb. And you've lost years of memories your entire career. But maybe I've also lost the parts of myself that weren't working, Caleb interrupted. Maybe this is a chance to figure out who I really am when I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. Over the following days, Caleb settled into a routine at his parents' ranch that felt both foreign and familiar. He woke early each morning to help with the daily chores, feeding cattle and horses, checking fences, and maintaining equipment. The physical work felt good, and his body seemed to remember the rhythms of ranch life, even when his mind couldn't access specific memories. His parents were careful not to push him to remember things, but they shared stories about his childhood that helped fill in some of the gaps in his personal history. He learned that he had been an exceptional student until high school, when his interest in rodeo had begun to overshadow everything else. He had received a partial academic scholarship to Texas A&M University, but had left after 2 years to pursue bull riding full-time, a decision that had caused considerable tension within the family. "We were worried that you were throwing your life away," his father admitted during one of their evening conversations on the front porch. "You were smart enough to be anything you wanted to be, doctor, lawyer, engineer, and you chose to climb onto the backs of animals that were actively trying to hurt you. Did you ever support my decision?" Caleb asked. "Once you started winning, once it became clear that you had real talent, we came around," his mother said. "But we never stopped worrying. Every time the phone rang during rodeo season, part of me was afraid it was going to be news like what Tommy called with that night." Rachel visited frequently during Caleb's first weeks back home, often bringing veterinary supplies to treat minor injuries and ailments among the ranch animals. Watching his sister work with sick or injured cattle, Caleb was struck by her competence and confidence. She had clearly found her calling in a way that he was beginning to realize he might never have with bull riding. "Do you love what you do?" he asked her one afternoon as she treated a calf with a respiratory infection. "Most days," Rachel replied, not looking up from her patient. "It's challenging and rewarding, and I feel like I'm making a real difference in the world." "Why do you ask?" "I'm trying to figure out if I ever felt that way about bull riding. Everyone talks about how successful I was, how much money I made, how many championships I won. But no one talks about whether I actually enjoyed it." Rachel finished administering the antibiotic injection before answering. "You used to," she said carefully. "When you first started, you talked about it like other kids talked about video games or sports. You were genuinely excited about learning new techniques, about understanding the animals, about pushing yourself to be better. What changed? The money, maybe. The pressure. The expectations. Somewhere along the line it stopped being about the joy of riding and started being about maintaining your ranking, about defending your reputation. You became afraid of losing rather than excited about winning." That evening, Caleb called Tommy to ask if he could visit the following day. Since the accident, Tommy had been staying with friends in the Fort Worth area, unsure whether he wanted to continue competing or follow Caleb's lead in stepping away from the sport. "I need to see some of my riding footage," Caleb explained. "Not just the highlight reels that Emma has been showing me, but the regular rides, the ones where I was just trying to make 8 seconds and collect a paycheck." Tommy arrived the next morning with a laptop full of video files spanning several years of Caleb's career. They sat in the living room while his parents diplomatically found other things to do, giving them space to explore this difficult territory together. The videos were revealing in ways that Caleb hadn't expected. In the early footage from 5 or 6 years ago, he could see a young man who was clearly enjoying himself despite the obvious danger. Even when he was thrown, even when rides ended badly, there was a resilience and enthusiasm in his body language that spoke to someone who genuinely loved what he was doing. But as the videos progressed chronologically, Caleb could see subtle changes in his demeanor. The joy became more subdued, replaced by a kind of grim determination. His pre-ride rituals became more elaborate and superstitious. His interactions with other riders seemed more guarded, more competitive. "I look miserable in some of these," Caleb observed, watching footage from a competition earlier in the year. "Like I'm going through the motions because I don't know how to do anything else." "You were feeling a lot of pressure to win another world championship," Tommy explained. "You'd won it once 3 years ago, and everyone expected you to win it again. You put so much pressure on yourself that it wasn't fun anymore. Is that why you kept doing it, even when it wasn't fun?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, staring at the frozen image of Caleb on the laptop screen. "I think we both got caught up in the idea that we were supposed to be bull riders. Like, that's who we were, so that's what we had to keep doing even when our hearts weren't in it anymore. And now I'm thinking maybe it's time to figure out what else we might be good at." That afternoon, Caleb saddled Ranger for the first time since the accident. The process felt as natural as breathing. His hands seemed to know exactly how to adjust the stirrups, how to position the saddle, how to communicate with the horse through subtle pressure and movement. When he swung into the saddle, the feeling was so familiar and comfortable that he almost cried with relief. He rode out across the family's pastures, following fence lines and cattle trails that his body seemed to navigate from memory. The rhythm of the horse's gait, the feel of the reins in his hands, the subtle communication between horse and rider, all of it felt like rediscovering a language he had thought was lost forever. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple, Caleb found himself at the top of a small hill that overlooked the entire ranch. Below him, cattle grazed peacefully in the golden light, and in the distance he could see the lights beginning to come on in the farmhouse where his family was probably preparing dinner. For the first time since the accident, Caleb felt a sense of peace that wasn't complicated by confusion or loss. This place, this life, these relationships, they felt real in a way that the world of professional bull riding never had, at least not in the videos he had been watching. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "How was the ride? Your mom is making your favorite dinner, even though you probably don't remember it being your favorite." As he turned Ranger back toward the barn, Caleb realized that he was looking forward to dinner with his family, to the simple pleasure of sharing a meal and conversation with people who loved him for who he was rather than what he had accomplished. It was a feeling he couldn't remember having experienced in any of the videos from his professional career. Maybe Emma was right, and this accident had taken away an important part of his identity. But as he rode through the gathering dusk toward the warm lights of home, Caleb began to suspect that it might have given him something even more valuable in return: the chance to remember who he had been before he became someone else entirely. 2 months after the accident, Caleb stood in the doorway of his Fort Worth condo for the first time since the injury, feeling like an archaeologist exploring the life of a stranger who happened to share his name. The space was immaculate and expensive, with leather furniture, stainless steel appliances, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the city skyline. But despite the obvious quality and careful decoration, it felt cold and impersonal, like a high-end hotel room rather than a home. Emma moved through the space with the familiarity of someone who had spent significant time there, opening blinds and checking mail that had accumulated during his absence. "You bought this place about 3 years ago," she explained, "right after you won your first world championship. You said you wanted something that reflected your success." Caleb examined the framed photographs that lined the mantelpiece above the gas fireplace. There were images of him receiving championship buckles, posing with other riders he didn't recognize, standing beside expensive trucks and horses at various events. What struck him most was how alone he looked in many of the photos, even when he was surrounded by people. His smile in most of the images looked practiced rather than genuine. "Did I spend much time here?" he asked, running his hand along the granite countertop in the kitchen. "Not really," Emma admitted. "During the season, you were on the road most weekends. And when you were home, you usually preferred to stay at the ranch with your parents. This place was more like, I don't know, like a symbol of what you thought you were supposed to want." In the master bedroom, Caleb discovered a walk-in closet filled with expensive Western wear, custom-made shirts, designer jeans, boots that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and an entire wall dedicated to championship buckles and trophy saddles. It was like finding a costume shop devoted to maintaining the image of a person he couldn't remember being. "Jesus," he said softly, pulling a shirt from one of the hangers. The price tag was still attached. $450 for a piece of clothing that looked identical to shirts he could buy at any Western wear store for $30. "You said image was important in professional sports," Emma explained, though her tone suggested she had never entirely agreed with the philosophy. "That sponsors wanted to work with riders who looked successful and professional." Caleb found a box of financial documents in the home office that painted a picture of a life that had been both lucrative and expensive. His career earnings over the past 5 years exceeded $2 million, but his expenses had grown to match his income. The condo, the truck, the horses, the travel costs, the entry fees. Everything had been scaled to support a lifestyle that required constant success to maintain. "What happens if I can't compete anymore?" he asked Emma as they sat in the living room, surrounded by the evidence of a life he couldn't remember choosing. "Well, you have some savings, and there might be disability insurance through the Professional Bull Riders Association. But honestly, most of your money was tied up in maintaining this lifestyle." She gestured around the expensive apartment. "You always said you'd worry about retirement later, when you were ready to stop competing." "I need to sell this place," Caleb said suddenly. "And the truck, and probably most of this stuff. None of it feels like me." Emma looked surprised by the decisiveness in his voice. "Are you sure? I mean, you worked really hard to afford all this. Maybe you should wait until your memories come back before making any major financial decisions." "My memories aren't coming back," Caleb said with a certainty that surprised even himself. "Dr. Hawkins said as much at my last appointment. And even if they did, I don't think I'd want to be the person who thought he needed $400 shirts to feel important. Over the following weeks, Caleb began the process of dismantling the life he couldn't remember building. He sold the condo at a modest loss, traded the expensive truck for a more practical Ford F-150, and donated most of the designer clothes to charity. The championship buckles and trophies he kept, not because they meant anything to him personally, but because they represented achievements that might be important to him someday, even if that day hadn't come yet. The process was both liberating and melancholy. With each possession he sold or gave away, he felt lighter, more like himself. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that he was erasing the evidence of years of hard work and dedication, even if those years belonged to someone he couldn't remember being. Tommy had made his own decision to retire from bull riding, and the two men spent several afternoons working together to organize and sell their accumulated gear. Tommy's decision had been more gradual than Caleb's, based on a growing awareness that his body couldn't take much more punishment and his heart wasn't fully committed to the lifestyle anymore. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said as they loaded boxes of riding equipment into the back of a truck headed for a consignment shop. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I can't remember the last time I was truly excited about getting on a bull. It became a job somewhere along the line, and not a particularly pleasant one." "So what are you going to do now?" Caleb asked. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. My dad's been wanting me to come back and help run the family ranch. It's not glamorous, and it doesn't pay like bull riding at our level did, but it's honest work. And I think I'd sleep better at night knowing I wasn't going to wake up in a hospital emergency room." "That sounds nice," Caleb said, and he meant it. The idea of work that was challenging but not dangerous, meaningful but not constantly stressful, appealed to him in ways that his former career apparently never had. His relationship with Emma had been evolving slowly during his recovery, shifting from the familiar intimacy they had apparently shared to something more like a careful friendship. She had been patient and understanding about his memory loss, but both of them were grappling with the question of whether they were trying to rebuild something that had been genuine or simply comfortable. "I need to ask you something," Emma said one evening as they sat on the porch swing at his parents' ranch, watching the sun set over the pastures. "And I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay, if we had just met, if you didn't know that we had a history together, would you be interested in getting to know me? Not as someone you're supposed to care about, but as a person you might actually want to spend time with." Caleb considered the question carefully. Emma was undeniably attractive, intelligent, and kind. She had shown tremendous loyalty and compassion during his recovery. But if he was being completely honest, he wasn't sure whether his feelings for her were based on genuine attraction or a sense of obligation to the relationship they had apparently shared. "I think you're an amazing person," he said carefully. "You've been incredibly supportive during all this, and I can see why the other version of me fell for you. But I also think we both deserve better than trying to force something that might not be there anymore." Emma nodded, and he could see relief in her expression along with the sadness. "I've been thinking the same thing. I loved the man you were, but I'm not sure either of us knows who you are now. And it's not fair to either of us to try to recreate something that might have run its course anyway. Can we still be friends?" Caleb asked. "I mean, you're one of the few people who knew me before, and I'd hate to lose that connection entirely." "I'd like that," Emma said. "And who knows? Maybe someday, when you've figured out who you want to be and I've figured out what I want from life, we might find our way back to each other. But for now, I think we both need some space to grow." The conversation was sad, but also strangely liberating. For the first time since the accident, Caleb felt like he was making decisions based on what felt right for the person he was becoming rather than trying to honor commitments made by the person he used to be. Dr. Sarah Chun, the neuropsychologist his family doctor had recommended, helped him work through the complex emotions surrounding his identity reconstruction. During their weekly sessions, she encouraged him to think of his memory loss not as a deficit, but as an opportunity to consciously choose the kind of person he wanted to be. "Most people sleepwalk through major life decisions," Dr. Chun explained during one of their sessions. "They choose careers based on other people's expectations, maintain relationships out of habit, build lifestyles that serve their image rather than their happiness. You have a unique opportunity to make conscious choices about all of these things. But how do I know if I'm making good choices if I can't remember the lessons I learned from my mistakes?" Caleb asked. "You can't avoid making mistakes," Dr. Chin replied. "But you can choose to make new mistakes rather than repeating old ones. From what you've told me about your former lifestyle, It sounds like you were caught in patterns that weren't serving your long-term happiness. This accident might have been the disruption you needed to break free from those patterns. As winter settled over central Texas, Caleb found himself settling into a rhythm of life that felt both familiar and completely new. He worked alongside his father during the day, learning aspects of ranch management that he had apparently never been interested in during his original childhood on the property. In the evenings, he read voraciously, trying to educate himself about subjects that interested the person he was becoming: sustainable agriculture, animal husbandry, business management. His relationship with his family had deepened in ways that surprised everyone involved. Without the distraction of his professional career and the travel schedule that had kept him away for most of the year, he was present in a way he apparently hadn't been since high school. He attended his niece's school plays, helped his mother with her church fundraisers, and spent long evenings talking with his father about everything from ranch economics to philosophy. "You know," his father said one evening as they worked together to repair a section of damaged fence, "I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time since you were about 16 years old." What was I like then? Before the bull riding took over, I mean. Curious about everything. You asked more questions than any kid I'd ever met, and you weren't satisfied with simple answers. You wanted to understand how things worked, why people made the choices they did, what made the difference between success and failure in any given endeavor. What happened to that curiosity? I think it got focused on one thing, bull riding, and everything else became less interesting to you. It wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was a narrowing. And now? His father smiled, tightening a wire with the fence pliers. Now you're asking questions about everything again. How we can improve the soil quality in the South pasture, whether we should be raising different breeds of cattle, what kind of long-term investment strategy makes sense for a family ranch. It's like watching someone wake up from a long sleep. Rachel had noticed the change too, commenting during one of her visits that Caleb seemed more engaged with the world around him than he had been in years. "You used to visit the ranch like you were checking off an obligation," she told him. "Now you act like you actually want to be here." "I do want to be here," Caleb replied. "This feels real in a way that nothing in those videos of my old life did. I can see the results of my work, I can help solve actual problems, and at the end of the day I know I've contributed something meaningful." As spring approached, Caleb made the decision to invest some of his remaining savings in expanding the family ranch operation. He researched sustainable grazing practices, investigated markets for grass-fed beef, and developed a business plan for diversifying their income streams. It was the first time since the accident that he felt genuinely excited about the future rather than simply accepting whatever came next. "Are you sure about this?" his mother asked as they reviewed the financial projections at the kitchen table. "You could still go back to school, get a degree in something that would give you more options." "I'm sure," Caleb said. "I know it might not make sense to someone looking from the outside, but this feels like what I'm supposed to be doing. Not because anyone expects it from me, but because it matches something inside me that I didn't even know was there." Tommy visited in March, having made his own transition back to his family's ranch in East Texas. He looked healthier than Caleb had ever seen him, with color in his face and a relaxed posture that spoke to the absence of constant stress and physical punishment. "I don't miss it," Tommy admitted as they sat on the front porch, watching Caleb's horses graze in the pasture. "I thought I would miss the adrenaline, the competition, the feeling of being good at something that most people can't do. But what I actually feel is relief. Relief. Relief that I don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. Relief that I can make plans for the future without wondering if I'll be too broken down to follow through on them. Relief that my biggest worry on any given day is whether we need to move the cattle to a different pasture, not whether I'm going to end up unconscious in an arena somewhere." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gotten hurt?" Tommy asked. "If you had kept riding and maybe won another championship?" Caleb considered the question while watching a red-tailed hawk circle over the pasture, riding the thermal currents with an efficiency that spoke to perfect harmony between creature and environment. "I think I would have kept riding until my body gave out or until something worse than a concussion happened," he said finally. "Not because I loved it, but because I didn't know how to be anyone else. The accident forced me to find out who I was underneath all the buckles and trophies, and I like that person better than the one in all those videos. No regrets. No regrets." As the sun set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, Caleb felt a sense of contentment that he was pretty sure the old version of himself had never experienced. He had lost his memories, his career, and his identity as he had known it. But in return, he had found something more valuable. A life that felt authentically his own, built on choices that served his happiness rather than his image. His phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. "Saw your interview in the Livestock Weekly about sustainable ranching. Dad is so proud he's been showing it to everyone at the feed store." Caleb smiled, remembering the conversation with the journalist who had been interested in his transition from professional bull riding to ranch management. It had been strange to talk about his former career as something that had happened to someone else, but it had also been liberating to focus on his current work and future plans rather than past achievements. If essa historia já mexicam você, esse inscreva no canale deixo seu, like para não perder nenhuma de nossas histórias. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Caleb walked out to the barn for his evening check on the horses. Ranger nickered softly as he approached, and the sound carried all the contentment and peace that Caleb had been searching for without knowing it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn and grow, and contribute something meaningful to the world. But tonight, he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, living exactly the life that fit him like a glove he had been waiting his whole life to find. The 8 seconds that had defined his former life had been replaced by something far more valuable. The endless possibility of all the seconds that lay ahead, each one his to choose, his to live, his to make matter in ways that had nothing to do with staying on the back of an animal that wanted to throw him off. He had finally learned that the most important ride of his life wasn't about conquering anything or proving anything to anyone. It was simply about finding his way home to himself.